Hey everyone, we're going to pick up our discussion of prenatal development from our embryonic phase, which is about 1 to 8 weeks, and then on into our fetal developmental phase, which is the rest of term for the mother who's carrying. And so that can be anywhere between 37 to 42 weeks kind of on average and ideally. And so the first stop, we're going to kind of look at what that continued growth and development looks like. And then we'll take a look at when some atypical or abnormal kind of development things can occur, both like intrinsically and extrinsically influencing the fetus. And that will kind of wrap up our discussion of prenatal kind of development. Okay, so, and I like to jokingly warn folks about the next slide. Despite the images of embryonic development that I have not found a good image to help support my discussion on this next part. So clearly this is not a fetus. This is like a toddler, but the same growth directionality or patterns that we see prenatally in a fetus also occurs when we go to learn our motor developmental skills later on as a toddler or a young child or infant. So this was the best image I got. That being said, let's talk about that. So when we're in the last parts of fetal development here, or just throughout fetal development, we tend to undergo a little bit more just pure growth. So we're talking about like adding mass, adding size and height versus say migrating cells to specific areas of our body to differentiate and become specialized cells. So again, the kind of embryonic development is that placing of cells in the appropriate locations and some growth there, but then again, mainly growth in size and development after. So we kind of come across these terms that we've usually seen with like muscles, but we can term them with any cells really throughout the body. So we get continued hyperplasia, which is an increase in number of cells, and then also hypertrophy, which is the size of them. And again, depending on which cells you're typically talking about in the body, you usually get hypertrophy, so growth in size, and then cell division, which is hyperplasia. And this kind of continues to add, again, mass and height to a lot of our body. Getting back to the point of directionality, though, so the red arrows represented on the two images on your right indicate the two types of directions of growth that we typically see, which is cephalo, meaning head, to caudal, which means tail, or you can think like head to bottom of your torso. And then it goes from proximal distal. So proximal being like the midline or close to the midline, and then distal being like far away from the torso, so distal from the body. And those two kind of growth patterns happen. So again, head size will grow, then torso, then limbs, then hands and feet at this stage. And then, that's kind of the two terms that we use to describe this directionality as far as actual physical growth. And when we look at, again, just kind of our stages from 9 weeks up to 40 weeks in this image, again, we're really just talking about size and growth that way. Okay. And of course, I like to acknowledge and draw attention to exactly what's happening internally in a carrying mother and expecting mother. Because I think as soon as you visually can see how a mother carries a fetus, it like becomes very obvious why a lot of the symptoms and physiological changes occur for them. And I kind of like start top to bottom on this one. So if we're looking at image again, I believe this is around 40 weeks of carrying. 40 weeks. We can see just if we're talking about lung capacity, it's pretty well recorded and documented that maternal lung capacity and respiratory function decreases significantly, and obviously there's some effects with fetal blood and oxygen supply and exchange that way. But I think even just purely looking at the total volume and capacity of lungs at that point in time, we see the liver is kind of pressed up a little bit into the diaphragm. So that in and of itself is going to restrict total lung capacity in a physical way. We look at the stomach for a second and compare that, in a non-pregnant body relative to a pregnant body, we can see that these folks have essentially a horizontal level stomach. And if you've ever dealt with indigestion or something called GERDs, which is like a gastrointestinal reflux disorder or anything like that, the suggestion is essentially to avoid having any horizontal level with your stomach, because the gastric juices can easily get back out into the esophagus here through the gastric sphincter. So I think, just seeing that again makes total sense when pregnant women are experiencing heartburn. Obviously, gastrointestinal issues, as we can see, a lot of guts are kind of pressed around. Last kind of stop is if we look at the bladder, a common concern or issue or expression of needing to go to the bathroom all the time or go pee quite often becomes very obvious when we see that the volume of the bladder and the amount of volume of fluid or urine that it can hold before nutrition or urination is very small. So again, I think just taking a little moment to pause and appreciate that here is always a great thing. And so we kind of get to this point now where, okay, if things have developed well, this is great, but there's definitely things that can arise that can lead to fetal anomalies or conditions or things that can occur, again, prenatally or before birth. So the first part that we're going to look at is intrinsic causes, and another way of kind of looking at that would be like genetic or things specific to the fetus. And for this, I'm going to do a fairly quick and sweeping review of genetics. I know maybe not a lot of you have had time with this. Definitely feel free, obviously, to stop the video, review the points on the slides. If you need some supplementary information, send me a message and we'll get you that for sure. So kind of our first stop is reviewing genes, genetics, DNA. We typically, I think, are most familiar with the double helix that we have with our DNA. But as a reminder, that gets wound up as well, and then typically is depicted by a X kind of shaped thing, and that thing is called a chromosome. But interestingly, we actually have more information now on what chromosomes look like. So there's this really cool thing done in chemistry called X-ray crystallography, and essentially you can have 3D structures, whether it's like proteins or very small chemical structures. You shoot an X-ray through it, and how it diffracts and is pictured on kind of for lack of better terminology, just a sheet or a piece of paper. That image essentially can be reverse engineered into what 3D structures look like. So what you're seeing in the bottom right hand corner here is actually kind of the shape at which chromosomes typically hold. So again, it's not just this nice kind of X shape, but more of a blob of wound DNA in that shape. So I think that's kind of interesting to keep in mind as well, because typically, parts of our chromosome or DNA that gets expressed most tends to be more easily accessible from enzymes or to be able to transcribe the information or kind of like copy the information off of our DNA, which then gets sent to cells in different parts of our bodies to produce proteins and enzymes and things like this, and chemical messengers to be able to get our bodies to do all the wonderful things they do. So I think that's kind of interesting to make note of. And again, oftentimes in biology and sciences, we have these kind of like idealized images, and we get to explore and find out that things are a little bit more nuanced than that. So on our chromosomes, kind of moving forward, we have these genes or grouping of information, I guess, that we could call alleles. And you can have alleles that are for a certain given trait or we could say like condition or something like that. So it's kind of the sequence that we group together and be like, this is our allele or a group of DNA information that will give us things like hair color, for example. Okay, and when we're talking about things that we can see that we get from our genes, that's called our phenotypes. So phenotypes are things that you can actually observe displayed by an organism or a person. And for example, like hair color is one, eye color, very common traits that we like to discuss as far as related to our genes. But there's definitely lots of things that aren't seen that are expressed or determined by these alleles on our genes that we don't see. So they wouldn't be phenotypical; they'd just be part of our genetic trait. So maybe something would be a predisposition for a heart condition or certain cancers, such as like breast cancer, or so you have the BRCA genes, and and because of that, those wouldn't necessarily be expressed, but a phenotype for hair or eye color would be. Okay. So from these genes, if we're talking prenatally still, we can take a look at how these genes for different conditions get passed along. And so we have dominant, recessive, sex-linked, and spontaneous mutations. I'm going to give a specific example for sex-linked and spontaneous mutations. But if we were to just talk about dominant traits and recessive traits for a second, if you haven't come across these graphs, feel free to pause, take some time to digest it a bit. It's really descriptive and helps very clearly illustrate how these different traits work. And oftentimes, it's not always quite this clear, especially when we're talking about genes and genetics and stuff like that. So, for example, you could have a dominant trait, but it may or may not actually become expressed fully in the body. But usually when we're talking about dominant and recessive traits, they tend to be a little bit more expressed in this way, and they tend to be, more... what's the word I'm looking for? It's less multifactorial, which means we have less influences, less number of genes and alleles contributing to a certain thing. We get to kind of talk about just, okay, these genes are either expressed or not, typically when we're talking about this. So classically when we talk about this. So here's the example. Dominant traits. For example, we call it autosomal, just means it's not one of our sex chromosome genes. So we have an unaffected parent and an affected parent, and kind of here's their chromosomes, and of course they get randomly assigned one from either parent to make a pairing for the children. And we have these potential random assortment outcomes that we could potentially see from these parents in these offspring. And essentially what this dominant gene is illustrating here is that any child, whether they happen to have one as long as they have one of the genes present, it will kind of dominate or take over relative to any recessive or non-present genes, and therefore become expressed. So to be an affected child, you essentially just have to have one affected gene present as seen received from this parent here, right? And then we can look at the other children. Because they don't have any of the dominant genes present, they happen to get a non-dominant gene from either parent, they're unaffected. A little bit different with a recessive gene. So let's say in this instance, both parents have an affected gene and a non-affected gene. Because it's recessive, it would not be expressed. And again, let's say this is a condition like cystic fibrosis. So both parents are carriers, although they wouldn't know it because they have a dominant gene present that makes up for a lack of let's say like a knocked out recessive gene here. And so what ends up happening is when we look at the possible outcomes, and again, randomly assigned, it's not necessarily always a 25% chance that this will happen per se, but we have a unaffected child who has both the non-affected gene, but and then if a child receives one affected and one non-affected gene from either of their parents, they become a carrier of the recessive gene, but not necessarily displaying anything like these three. And our last scenario, we have an affected child, so one affected gene and the other affected recessive gene both have to be present, then that child becomes affected by whatever allele expression that happens to be, which is really interesting, especially in some cases like sickle cell anemia and stuff, especially if you're a partial carrier. There's a lot of interesting research that instead of having like let's say kind of like a round inflatable tube kind of red blood cells, some of the blood cells get malformed and become like a half moon kind of sharp looking sickle shape. And what they've come to find is individuals that are like partial carriers are kind of fare better, and carriers tend to fare better against conditions like malaria because it's a bloodborne condition, and the red blood cells that become sickle-like can't be affected. So while there can be some partial expression typically in some genes, there's not always detriments. There's always some potentially some benefits too. Okay. So again, just to recap, that was dominant and recessive, and we're going to look at sex-linked and spontaneous. This is all kind of genetically driven during fetal development. Condition might be something called color blindness or red-green color blindness. Now, how this works is, we get a X and or Y chromosome, one from either of our parents. Fathers will give a Y chromosome, potentially, or an X chromosome. Mothers will be an X or an X chromosome. It's just one of the two. And typically what will happen is you'll have a mother who's carrying a recessive and so a not expressed color blindness gene, and it gets passed on the X chromosome only, and it'll get passed on to one of their offspring. So again, if it's the non-recessive sex-linked gene that gets passed on from either the father, in either condition, having the X chromosome passed on or a Y chromosome passed on, we see that we have unaffected children here. But if the mother passes on the affected X-linked allele or chromosome that has color blindness associated with it to, let's say, a daughter, we'll start there, they become a carrier, but because they have a dominant, let's say, non-color blindness on the other X chromosome that they receive, they end up just being a carrier but not expressing color blindness. So again, women cannot have this type of red-green color blindness. However, if that X-linked recessive allele gets passed on to an affected son, what can end up happening, because they only males only have a X or Y and Y chromosome, they don't have a second X chromosome that could have a dominant trait to mask or cover the color blindness, and therefore men, and this particular affected son, will become red-green colorblind. So, something at home that you can do, or wherever you happen to be watching this, you can look at these circles, and typically I start by asking, which one of these circles don't have a number in them, and then I ask, is this a trick question? And oftentimes there's someone in class that is like, yeah, for sure. There's like none of them have numbers, or like two of them have numbers, or whatever. A lot of people, especially women, say yes, there's numbers in each. And again, this is just a challenge for some people that that are colorblind. It's hard for them to differentiate between red and green. So kind of interestingly, to add on to this with vision, and rather than having like this colorblind kind of expression, what another thing that can come up with this as well is something called tetrachromy or chromacy. And the idea is we have 3 receptors in our eyes, photoreceptors, that we can attribute to color. And typically that's red, green, and blue. So we have 3 of them. So we're trichromy typically for this. But a few individuals, and this seems to be primarily occurs in a higher percentage for women. And again, it has to do with vision and being sex-linked is there's potentially 4, so tetra being 4 genes that code for vision, and again this is on the X chromosomes. And what happens is, those individuals, and again this can happen in men's, is you have your red, green, and blue cones, photoreceptors in the retina that picks up different color bandwidths on the electromagnetic spectrum. But these individuals also have a 4th one that is believed to be in and around the orange kind of bandwidth on the light spectrum. And because of that, what these individuals typically have is a capacity to differentiate between more colors. And there's a few tests that you can do with this. Aside from the fact that these individuals will describe most colors in the world almost like glow, they'll have more language and different words to describe more variations between colors. And although this might not be fully expressed to a point of being able to actually identify this in a lot of individuals, there's a belief that a larger population of women in the world tend to have this, and therefore can identify differences in colors. And part of the test is you're given a color palette with different shades, and you're supposed to identify as many shades and colors in there as you can and stuff. So kind of interesting. Again, a individual constraint is not always necessarily a negative thing. Sometimes it can bring more positive things, such as greater opportunities to see color, which potentially could help in a few situations if we're tying that back to our motor skills. Right? Okay, the next component we're going to see as far as genetic or intrinsic occurrences that can happen during fetal development would be again another increase as far as an extra chromosome. And so individuals that have this occur during again congenitally during development is called trisomy 21. So we have 3 instead of 2 chromosomes at the 21st slot as far as when we organize our chromosomes onto a panel. And it's more commonly known as Down syndrome. So individuals, and I've had the fortunate opportunity, if you work with many, typically kids with trisomy 21 in a clinic setting, and generally speaking, again, very typically, to generalize, usually quite pleasant and social and outgoing, and it always makes them generally fun to work with in the clinic. We all have our bad days for sure, and I'd be really interested to hear what caretakers' impressions are on these kind of typical personality traits. I know it's generally what I've experienced, but again, I've been in the clinic. It's been fun. We get to move around and do stuff like that. So, but more specifically, as far as motor development and things that you would notice as far as an individual constraint and being able to produce motor skills, is usually picking up motor skills for these individuals is a bit challenging. And so going to things like physiotherapy and different movement skill kind of classes or whatever is really, really important. And so one of the things that will come up with these individuals is something called hypotonicity, and essentially that's when we have what's called low tone throughout our body in that point in case in time. So all of us have tone in our body, and it's not the same tone that we think of when you go to a gym to tone up to get fit or whatever the case is. What this typically looks like more so is towards the general tone sent out from our brain to our body. So for example, if you're sitting somewhere, right, we have some tone going through our body so that our spines are kind of holding us upright. We don't have to think about this. It's just this general volume that's being sent out by our brainstem to kind of hold our bodies up. Very similarly, if I stand up, I have even more tone or a higher volume going throughout my body to just keep my muscles on, to keep me up. If I was to lay down, I could shut down way more tone, the volume would come way down, I can just relax. So if you're ever doing stretching, it's always great to do it lying down versus standing up, just to be able to get some more range and have the muscles turned off a little bit more, you could say. But these individuals, again, just generally have hypertonicity, again, depending on how affected the individual might be. And, working with them in a clinic or something, sometimes you'll see them just kind of like sit and like collapse into this what looks like a very uncomfortable kind of position, but they're just happy as clams to kind of be in like a front fold and like laying on the floor. And so that definitely comes up. And again, as you can imagine, as far as a individual constraint, when you go to perform a motor skill, having this low tonicity throughout your body could be challenging for sure. Okay. So that's kind of, again, all these intrinsic factors genetically that can happen. We, of course, have extrinsic factors. And how do things outside, let's say the mother, and outside the fetus actually get to affect the fetus, right? Because, again, we're kind of like in this amniotic fluid. We have lots of protection, that way and stuff. And quote unquote, we're kind of like supposedly isolated from the external world, but of course there's ways that we can be connected to the external world, and that's largely through an umbilical cord, right? And so through the mother. So how this is set up is actually, again, quite interesting, quite brilliant of a functional setup. Essentially, the big take home here is we do get, let's say, oxygen and carbon dioxide and nutrients such as like glucose and all these wonderful things delivered and then taken away from us as a fetus when we're developing, which is great. We need lots of energy, we need lots of fuel essentially to supply our metabolism to be able to grow and develop and go through all the things that we've spoken about so far. But this is done through a way where the maternal and fetal blood doesn't ever cross. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's no mixing at any point in time of fetal blood with maternal blood. And the way that happens is through these core ionic villi. And the structure is, and just to give you a little orientation here on this image before we kind of dive into it, here's kind of the blood flow, fetal blood flow, and going through the umbilicus or the umbilical cord, and it kind of winds up in here in these like little tree-like projections and stuff. You should note around this, kind of like a fluid-filled sac almost, in the placenta, which is like an extension of the uterine wall, we have these kind of, again, sacs of kind of micro capillary type sacs around these core ionic villi. And so you might be thinking, well, like, why do we have this structure? Like, why is this like this? Well, if you think about even just the term villi, we have these kind of finger-like projections called microvilli in our digestive tract, in our small intestine. And the whole point of that is to increase surface area, right? The more kind of projections and surface area that I have, the more opportunity these structures have for exchange of nutrients, or in this case, gas. And so that's kind of like the key component of this. So that's why, you see these like little tree-like structures and kind of look like branches and stuff like that. And again, I think the key thing to remember is there's no intermixing of blood here, okay? But again, things can pass through this. They're single cell thick, in a lot of these cases, which means things like oxygen and carbon dioxide can exchange. We get food and nutrients and hormones and stuff like that that can transfer through, that are really important for fetal development. That being said, we are also going to see things that we don't necessarily want to have transfer through there. So yes, potentially if small enough, we can have viral or different infections that way. We have nutrients that can pass, that might be too high or too low. Hormones similarly, physical pressure, temperature. This is a bit of a laundry list, but you can kind of pause. And I think a lot of these make sense if you just stop and kind of think about it. You're like, yeah, okay. I guess if nutrients can pass through, potentially too high or too low could affect it. Things like EMR, and again, just to speak about x-rays briefly, modern day x-ray machines, typically in a hospital setting, let's say, now produce very, very small amounts of radiation. But again, if you're pregnant, it's always like for sure a good conversation to have with any practitioner, like medical doctor, to be able to kind of say what sort of imaging you might want to consider. In particular, if you have a condition that needs lots of medical imaging, that might be something you want to, if possible, avoid, but that's not always possible. But again, nowadays, modern day technology is actually quite low when it comes to any radiation from imaging machines. The other thing that might be cause issues is low oxygen environments, and I guess you could potentially look at that as far as like any mountaineering and stuff like that. I think those are pretty straightforward. Maybe just to touch on temperature because it's pretty popular nowadays. Things like sauna and cold plunging and stuff like that would generally be considered unideal typically. Again, you can always speak to your medical practitioner about this, but I think, for example, hot tubbing and sauna and cold plunging is probably not ideal. Okay, here's where we're going to pump the brakes a little bit. We're actually going to talk about something called teratogens quite a bit. Okay, so these are any drugs or chemicals that can pass through the kind of like maternal fetal barrier, and typically they're anything that's smaller than 1,000 AMU. This is like atomic mass units. It's just kind of like a scale of measure, but so we'll talk about some of the more common ones here, but I kind of lumped in environmental pollutants and smoking with this too, because again, these are just kind of like external drugs or chemicals that can pass through that barrier. Okay, and one of the more common, I think, teratogens that have gotten out there and have been, relatively well studied and is more towards common knowledge now would be fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So I was fortunate enough in my undergrad to be able to work with kids with FASD and kind of develop this research program that used motor skills in particular as like a relative strength that these individuals have to be able to help with some of their other quality of life things. So what I mean by that is for individuals with FASD, and again, because it's a spectrum disorder, it means some folks are affected a little bit more than others. What you tend to see is the motor capacity is still relatively good. So because of that, being sports science students or kinesiology students, like you know and understand that all the benefits of exercise, right? Like decrease in stress, better social capacity, or more opportunities for social interaction, and kind of on and on. And so that was kind of like the window that we were hoping to use in this particular study. So again, I'd have to look back. This study carried on like many years after I had finished my undergrad, so it'd be interesting to see what the final results were. But yes, I believe there was some instances of decreased cortisol. Again, would have to check the literature on this, which would imply some decrease of stress through exercise. So and again, as far as phenotypical expression kind of varies. One of the challenges I do want to draw on research for this and just FASD in general is one of the criteria classically or historically had been having the mother state that they drank during pregnancy. Now the challenge with that, especially if you're trying to get funding for individuals with FASD, is the social stigma, because it's well known now that alcohol can affect fetal development. Most mothers feel guilty and or just don't want to admit that they had some drinks or a drink or whatever the case was while pregnant, and so getting a actual like full diagnosis of FASD was quite a challenge. So so that's just one of the little challenges that come up with that. And we're going to talk about how and when different teratogens can kind of affect development. But one of the key things, and this is a bit later, but just to give you a little bit of a sneak peek now. So if we're talking about brain and spinal cord sort of things, you can pause and investigate this. graph a little bit closer, but specifically with brain and spinal cord, this key phase where it's solid tends to have the most significant influences when teratogens affect development or external things. Yeah, and so what that means is a lot of the times our, let's say, nerves or neurons are migrating to the places where they need to be. So we tend to see a lot of like structural kind of deficits with this, and some pretty major ones. Whereas when you look at the striped portion, yes, in our nervous system there's still some migration happening, but a lot of it tends to do what we're seeing is a little bit more of the connections that occur at that point in time. And so we'll see a bit more like functional and maybe some minor kind of structural things, because for the most part the cells are actually in the place where we want them to be. It's just like kind of the finalizing kind of hypertrophy kind of the cells and stuff, so that might get affected by, let's say, a teratogen. Okay, so kind of last stop here as far as different conditions that come up. I'm going to suggest that you can kind of take a peek into some of these other things that might affect motor development or motor skills if and when they kind of occur prenatally or like perinatally, so during birth or delivery. But the main thing I just want to give you a little bit of a background on is this thing called thalidomide. And the main reason for that is it really historically was the first well-identified and kind of landmark prenatal teratogen that the medical community clearly identified affects fetal development and allowed us to realize, oh wait, alcohol, tobacco, like all these other substances actually affect fetal development as well. And so thalidomide was actually a medicine that was given to pregnant mothers by medical doctors in order to help with morning sickness. Okay, and so what ended up happening is they were realizing, this is back in like the 1950s, 1960s, I believe, is that what happened is you'd have physical birth kind of anomalies that would occur. So for example, limbs that wouldn't be fully formed, such as arms, you wouldn't have fully formed fingers. Individuals that were affected by this, there's some cognitive deficits. So again, it kind of just depended on what part of your first trimester that you're taking this for during your pregnancy. But yeah, again, it was just kind of like the first time where there's like very obvious instances where it was like, oh, if this was prescribed, then these kind of anomalies congenitally would happen. So again, it just kind of was a big alarm bell and flag for further investigation into what else affects fetal development. Good. So that was kind of things maybe unideally that can occur that affect fetal development and therefore motor skills and motor development as far as a individual structural constraint that kind of comes up. But what can we do to help ensure like a nice healthy fetal development? Well, the first thing, since we were just talking about it, is avoid any teratogens. That's kind of the first and simplest. Secondly would be taking folic acid supplements, and this goes back to our chat about neural tube deficits. I think we spoke about it there. Typically women's multivitamins will have folic acid, but someone will choose to take it as like an extra supplement as well. Exercise, again, you don't want to be pushing for any new personal bests, and again, always good to like chat with a medical professional of what's best for you. But again, light exercise, not beyond what you'd previously been kind of maintaining up until the point in time of pregnancy, is important. Listening to your body, again, as someone who's pregnant or trying to become pregnant, is always really great as well. There's some nutritional stuff as well, things to kind of avoid is like mercury and different unpasteurized foods and stuff like that. general limit caffeine under 200 milligrams a day. For perspective, a shot of espresso, I think a single shot is about 80 milligrams, or 1 cup of coffee would probably, if it's like an actual cup, would be under that as well. Yeah, and I think as far as like vitamins and minerals, the kind of last thing would be B12 for energy, and checking your levels for iron. You don't want to over supplement with iron, because that can accumulate within the body. For some individuals, actually more readily than others. For example, there's a certain allele or gene that can kind of increase the amount of iron accumulation in your body fairly quickly. So definitely good to just check before considering that. And then last and certainly not least is getting your vaccinations to prevent any preventable infections from viruses. Yeah. I think to speak to one last thing, especially when following, I think, a healthy diet, the idea is you want to maintain typically whatever weight you're generally at, aside from any added weight that the amniotic fluid and fetus themselves kind of contribute. And again, this is always a little bit different for everyone. But yeah, so kind of definitely not trying to lose weight or anything like that while pregnant, I think is key. But one of the things is that's not always necessarily possible. And so kind of from personal experience to kind of contribute a thought here. Some of the time, especially in parts of the world, which includes here in British Columbia, Canada, there's definitely people who live in poverty and are hungry, although, we don't always see that. But I was fortunate enough to be able to do a trip in my undergrad to go to rural parts of India and kind of compare across areas that were of higher socioeconomic status or had more affluence or more money in certain areas relative to those that aren't. And I kind of traveled with this healthcare team, and so they'd weigh like adolescent girls to make sure they're getting enough nutrition. And the way this kind of worked, or why this happened, is for individuals that were underweight or had a low birth weight or anything like this, due to lack of money and being able to have enough food or access to food. What is possible is later in life, in particular, the sooner the better, of course, but once you start being able to eat more, you tend to see changes in both like height percentile and obviously weight percentile too. So, for example, underweight babies and preemie babies or toddlers that happen to be underweight, again, once they're getting good and sufficient nutrition as far as energy and nutrients, you can kind of correct that kind of deficit that might have previously existed. So, whereas even though things, and we'll talk about this on the start of the next lecture, even though genetics might have this kind of predisposition range as far as like height, if you're on the lower end based off your genes because of malnourishment, you do have time to kind of make up for that. So yeah, that's great to know. Awesome. So that concludes our fetal development now. The next lecture is going to cover kind of postnatal trends across 4 different systems. And the first stop, we're going to pick up and continue on the discussion about growth height and weight over a lifespan.